Hi. So today on Easter Friday, I'd like to talk a little bit about grief for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm not necessarily going to get into today. But grief is a particular lens that I do, or filter perhaps, that I do tend to look through when I'm looking at what's happening around us. And it seems that it's a really important aspect. It's a really important part of what we're going through together at the moment as we cope with coronavirus and the effects of it. And if you look at the HMAS Sunshine Facebook page, you'll see a good article that I've posted there about grief and our feelings of grief as we go through these times. So I'm not a psychologist, and I'm not even anyone with a particular authority to talk about grief. So I'm speaking through my own experience, and here's the disclaimer. I love sitting with people, I love observing people, and I love reading about people's experiences, sharing their stories, but I can't speak for other people. So any kind of reflection that I give is always coloured by my own experience. And that's how I work. So forgive me if this sounds a bit self-indulgent, but I do sense that there's a lot that we can gain by sharing each other's grief experience. And I think there's heaps to be gained from hearing about the grief experiences of people that have already gone through profound grief. And I'm specifically talking about people who have gone through mental illness, particularly from being someone healthy to someone being diagnosed with mental illness or chronic illness. Because grief is about loss, and it's often not simply the loss of a loved one. It's the kind of daily grief of encountering the loss of mobility, relationships, independence, expectations, dreams, health. And the fear that comes with that loss of never being able to get those things back again, and not knowing, and being in a place where there may be hope, and even if there is hope, there is this tangible fear that loss is going to be a forever loss. So I've decided that I want to tell you about one of my own grief stories, because it's one that I'm seeing elements of all around me at the moment, and there's lots of bits of it that I see out there. And for me, it's about a particular story that I have with grief, and it's the time where we discovered that our son had a mental disability and autism, and that this would affect him for life. And you know, there's a lot of things I'm going to leave out of this story, but there's a couple of key things that I want to put in because I think we can see them around us. So firstly, I remember having a birthday dinner after sitting with the paediatrician a few days earlier as she laid out the assessments and the diagnosis. And a few days later, I'm sitting with friends, eating good food. There's laughter, there's all the normal things that are going on, but I just felt so completely lost and overwhelmed and numb and so sad. And, you know, my husband felt the same, and we were sitting in this space where nothing had changed fundamentally. We still had the same friends, we still had good food. Our son was still the beautiful child he'd always been. But the whole world suddenly looked and felt so different. And it was just earth-shattering for us to have this sense that we'd lost something that we couldn't even articulate. And then I remember about a year later that I was at a point where I felt much more aware of the fact that some of that was grief, and that grief was a part of our story as parents. And I could feel it, but in retrospect, when I look back now, it was just the tip of the iceberg. But what I decided to do at Jack's Kinder was to put a little flyer together for other families and children that kind of introduced Jack and said, you know, had a lovely little picture of him, and then it had some words saying, I'm Jack, these are the things I love, I'm very friendly, come say hello. And this is what you may have noticed about me, or just kind of explaining why, say, Jack didn't talk. And part of the reason I did this is there'd been an awful segment on a current affairs show not long beforehand that had shown autistic children as being violent and out of control. And it was just so horrible, nothing like our Jack. And I knew that there'd been parents asking the teachers at the kindergarten about Jack, and they couldn't say anything because of privacy. So I thought, well, I'm going to do this positive thing. So I did, and it went really well. And I put other information on it saying, look, here's a website you can go to if you want to find out more about autism, or give me a call, I'm happy to talk to you. And anyway, I did that. And a little while later, I was chatting to one of the teachers at the kindergarten, and she said to me something like, oh, I'm so glad you did that. You've been, as parents, you guys have been so proactive about getting your son interventions and, about doing things for him straight away. And then she said, I've come across a few parents now who it's obvious to us that their children have special needs, but they're just totally in denial. And, it's so heartbreaking. It's so hard for us to see this. And I just remember taking a deep breath at that point and just being so hit by a realization. And it was almost like I could see myself in third person. It was almost I jumped out of myself, and I could just see myself say to this teacher without really even knowing what I meant. I said, no, you're making it sound like we're good parents and these other parents are bad parents. And it's got nothing to do with that. It's about trying to separate yourself from the suffering and the pain and the grief. So our way of putting all that stuff that we can't handle yet away has been to jump straight in and to do as much as we can, to say, oh right, we're going to beat this, we're going to fight it, we're going to get a speech pathologist, we're going to get an occupational therapist, and that was our way of coping with that. And just as effective way of dealing with that pain and grief is to say, this is just not happening. I can't deal with this. I'm putting it over there. It's both of these ways of putting this distance. And of course, I even remember saying at the time, it's only going to last so long. This stuff's going to come and get us. But right now, this is what we can do to try and put a barrier between us and this pain. And of course, it didn't last. It was this, even though I was aware of that grief at the time, it was a simmering kind of grief. I actually didn't get hit by the full baseball bat of grief some years later, and I got to tell you, it was messy. And I didn't know, I would never have said it was grief at the time, but it was messy. It hit, and I was full of anger and resentment and blame. I felt incredibly isolated. I hurt people that didn't deserve it. Mainly I hurt my husband. He just got the brunt of everything, and so much was his fault. Of course, he was dealing with grief in his own way, and perhaps some of that wasn't as useful in the long term, but we had this clash. And of course, this happens in a lot of cases with couples of children who are bringing up a child with a special need. And this is a, I'm taking an extreme example here where you have a partner who's coping by being in denial and a partner that's coping by jumping in and doing everything. They're actually coping with the same things. They're trying to get a handle on their suffering. But of course, it just gets so messy. So here we are in a space where there's so much of that right now. And it just feels so poignant to me to be talking about this kind of grief, particularly on Easter Friday, because as Christians, we can sit here on Friday wanting to go straight to the hope on Sunday, and we can see that, and we want to do all the things that we can do to get to that point, to get to that Sunday. And I can see so much of it happening now in what we're doing, in our conversations around where this is all going. Like we're all hoping that there's something good coming out of this, that we're learning something together, that we're having quiet time, that we're having retreat, that we're building resilience, that we're going to come out of this. We're going to come out of this better, with better hope, with something better to hold to. But my fear is that we're jumping Easter Saturday a bit here. We're jumping the fact that there's deep suffering that's happening right now, and there's suffering that's probably coming our way too. And I think this is where I see the importance of hearing the stories, because there are people living in our communities, people with chronic illness, people living with mental illness and mental disability, people living with injury, all sorts of people that have gone through this kind of grief that we're trying to deal with now. And in a lot of those cases, they haven't been able to use the same distractions as some of us are privileged enough to use. They haven't been able to say, oh, well, I'll do some craft. I'll write a book. They've just had to sit with a sense of maybe I will never get those things back again. And so I guess I'm perhaps suggesting that an invitation, an Easter Saturday invitation that we could keep moving with beyond Easter, is sitting down with people and sharing our grief stories, because I think we've all had grief stories. I mean, so I'm someone that also lives with a chronic illness, and 10 years ago I did go through another grief journey through diagnosis and through being very, very ill, and at the time not even knowing if I'd walk or ride a bike again. Spoiler alert, I can. But it was really helpful to know that I had at least some self-awareness of that other grief journey and some of those things that just don't look like how we might stereotype as grief. Anyway, I have absolutely zero social media presence, so perhaps my HMAS Sunshine site isn't the best place to leave your grief stories or share your grief stories, but I would really love to hear them if you would like to share them. But otherwise, I'd maybe just share them with each other. I don't know. Sit for a while. Not maybe, I guess, sit with the unknowing, not knowing what Sunday is going to look like, what the future is going to look like, but sitting with the different ways and looking around and identifying the different ways that we're all dealing and coping with grief. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of anger and sadness, and there's a lot of people that are desperately wanting to not sit with the suffering. And, of course, I'm not saying, people have to deal in, some people probably can skip through stages, and stages are wibbly wobbly and go all over the place. And I'm not saying that there's one particular grief journey, because there certainly isn't, but there's just so many stories I think we need to hear right now. That's all I'm saying. So, happy Easter. And may your Easter Sunday bring hope, and may your conversations be fruitful, and may we all look after each other, take care of each other, sit with each other's stories with so much compassion. I think that's just something that's needed beyond a lot of other things, is the acknowledgement that our stories are going to be very different, and we need to be able to listen to them. And that's it. I'm waffling. I'll see you next time.